Mr. President, I'd like to follow up a little bit on what the senator from New Hampshire just spoke about, and that is the absurdity, the absolute absurdity of what's going on in Washington today. Mr. President, our nation used to have a two-party system in this country, but it's increasingly apparent that one of our two parties has morphed into some kind of a quasi-religion driven by one ideology: preserving and expanding tax breaks for the wealthy and for big corporations. To that end, many Republicans in Congress are perfectly willing to push the United States of America into defaulting on its debt obligations with dire economic consequences. This is a very dangerous detour in our nation's political and economic life. But just as dangerous as the prospect of a default on our debt obligations is the Republicans' determination to defund and dismantle as much of the federal government as possible. To that end, they're demanding deep, draconian cuts to federal funding and investment at a time when unemployment is already sky high and rising and when our economy remains fragile. To justify these deep cuts, Republicans, with this new ideology that they have articulated an absurd economic theory, absolutely absurd. They claim that slashing federal funding and investments by trillions of dollars will somehow magically create jobs. I don't know of any mainstream economist, anyone with an ounce of common sense, who agrees with this bizarre theory. To the contrary, economists warn us this is absolutely the wrong time to be slashing federal investment. Well, for the obvious reason that deep, short-term cuts to federal spending will dramatically reduce demand in the economy, thus reducing employment even further. Already this year, cuts to government spending at the state and local levels have destroyed an estimated 500,000 public sector jobs. And that goes along with an undetermined number of private sector jobs that work with these public sectors. Economists understand that terminating the jobs of teachers, police officers, other essential public employees has the same negative impact on the economy as eliminating private sector jobs. Now, nonetheless, as if they live in some kind of a parallel upside-down universe, Republicans insist that slashing federal funding and investment will create jobs. Well, let's test that theory. Let's test that theory in just one area of federal investment. Let's take transportation funding. Everybody understands that our transportation infrastructure is woefully inadequate. It's in a state of increasing disrepair, overloaded. Most people understand that ramping up investments in modernizing our highways and bridges and public transit systems would strengthen our economy, create millions of jobs. These are the veins and the arteries of our commerce. So what have the Republicans in the House proposed? Last week, Republican leaders put forward a new transportation authorization bill that would slash current investments in transportation by more than one-third. One-third cut in transportation. So will this create jobs, as the Republicans claim? Of course not. The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee estimates that the House bill would destroy more than 490,000 highway construction jobs and close to 100,000 transit-related and mass transit. So, Mr. President, this is pure folly. This is a classic example of what happens when ideological obsessions cause members of Congress to be blind to practical, common-sense realities. I have repeatedly come to the floor to advocate for a balanced approach to bringing our deficits under control, one that includes both some spending cuts and revenue increases. At the same time, economists warn us that we need a deficit reduction plan that defers the lion's share of spending cuts for several years, allowing our economy to recover before the negative impacts are felt. I must also ask, Mr. President, why are we proposing to slash all these fundings for highways and schools and infrastructure here at home, while we continue to spend untold billions of dollars to build highways, schools, and infrastructure in Afghanistan. A lot of times people ask me, they say, okay, Senator Harkin, you say you're willing to cut spending where? Well, right here. Let's start right here. Let's start with Afghanistan and Iraq. We're spending $168 billion in Iraq and Afghanistan this year alone. $168 billion. This year, fiscal year 2011, we're spending more than $13 billion to train the Iraqi and Afghan security forces. $13 billion. Okay? What did we spend here in America to retrain our workers so they can get new jobs? Less than $10 billion. We're spending more money to train Afghan and Iraqi forces, security forces, than we're spending to retrain our own workers all over America. 24 million Americans, unemployed or underemployed, and yet we're spending $168 billion this year on Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, again, I applaud the President for the actions he's taken, but quite frankly, Mr. President, they don't go far enough. The President should have a faster timetable for our troops to get out of Afghanistan. I've said that publicly many times. So if you really want to save some money, save that $1 million that it costs to keep one soldier in Afghanistan and get them back here. You know, we went to Afghanistan to get the Taliban out, get al-Qaeda out, and to get Osama bin Laden. Well, we got Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda is no longer in Afghanistan, and the Taliban's gone. So what are we still doing there? Why are we still there? Why are we still spending about $14 billion a month in Afghanistan? So, Mr. President, again, we need a balanced approach. Spending cuts alone won't do the job. I think the Republicans have just proved this. The Republicans have proved that spending cuts alone will not get the job done. How do I say that? Because look at the Republican budget, the so-called Ryan budget. It dismantles Medicare, guts Medicaid, makes severe cuts across the federal budget, yet it still adds trillions of dollars to the deficit for years to come, largely because it refuses to touch tax breaks for the well-to-do or to raise other revenues from corporations. Well, Mr. President, the Republicans have said they don't want to raise taxes on so-called job creators. They don't want to raise taxes on job creators. Well, to call trust fund millionaires and Wall Street money manipulators job creators is laughable. Meanwhile, to call many large corporations in the United States job creators is increasingly questionable. In one respect, actually, you can argue that America's big brand name corporations, GE, Microsoft, and so on, are, quote, job creators. Problem is, they're not creating jobs here. They're creating them overseas and eliminating them here. U.S. Commerce Department data shows that during the 2000s, U.S. companies, multinational companies, cut their workforces here at home by 2.9 million. 2.9 million, and increased their workforces overseas by 2.4 million. Yeah, they're creating jobs, all right, they're just not creating them here in America. And to add insult to injury, there are provisions in the U.S. tax code that promote this kind of behavior. The kind of tax breaks that Republicans insist on preserving. So they don't want to tax job creators. And yet we've shown, the data is there, these big multinationals are creating the jobs overseas. We would like to, I would like to, I'm sure the occupant of the chair would like to, close some of those loopholes so there's not a tax benefit to shipping your jobs overseas. Republicans say no. They don't want to do that. In the month of May, the U.S. trade deficit soared to more than $50 billion, the highest level in nearly 3 years. Just 1 month. 1 month. And the trade deficit, that $50 billion, just for one country, was half of that, China, $25 billion trade deficit. Now those figures, you might say, what does that mean? Well, those figures represent a transfer of millions of jobs and billions in wages from the United States to China or to other countries abroad. We need to seriously examine our trade policies also, which continually send jobs and wages overseas. We need to stop bowing before the sacrosanct altar of, quote, free trade, as if it doesn't even warrant our examination. Instead, we need to ask how we can make our trade policies work for the middle class. For instance, by defending America's right to oppose currency manipulation and abusive trade practices. Just one area alone. We ought to start talking about fair trade, fair trade, fair trade, not free trade, free trade, free trade. Because you see where free trade gets us if we don't stand up to other countries who manipulate their currencies, like China, and to whom we're shipping all our jobs and our money. So, Mr. President, as I've said, our economy, I think, is at the point of maximum danger. This Congress is at an historic decision point with regard to raising the debt ceiling and bringing deficits under control. However, as we've seen played out in the press, in the media, standing in the way of a rational, reasonable compromise, are congressional Republicans' ideological obsession with preserving tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires at any and all costs. They have rejected the President's deficit reduction plan that was $4 trillion. He went over halfway. They rejected that. Now they're threatening to force us to default on the national debt. And I'll just close on this, Mr. President. I heard our distinguished minority leader, the senator from Kentucky, said that this was now Obama's economy. And the problems we have is because of Obama, because he's been there almost 3 years, 2.5 years now. So therefore, he owns it. You know, this is really a kind of an interesting world we're living in. We have a debt ceiling. And why has the debt gone up? The debt's gone up because we borrowed money. We borrowed a lot of money. The Congressional Budget Office says that the debt that we have today comes from, number one, now remember, 10 years ago right now, we had a surplus, a budget surplus, one of the largest in our nation's history, left thanks to President Clinton. Well, then President Bush comes into office, Republicans take over the House, Republicans take over the Senate. What do? They ram through a massive tax cut. Takes those surpluses and gives them mostly to the wealthy in our country. And then 9/11 happens and we enter into 2 wars, totally unpaid for. Just borrow it. Borrow it from China, borrow it from wherever, borrow the money to pay for 2 wars. Then we had a Medicare drug prescription benefit, most of which benefits, by the way, go to the drug companies. And we didn't pay for that. We borrowed money for that also. And so the debt that we have today that we're grappling with is because of policies enacted by a Republican president and a Republican Congress. So they ran up the debt, now they don't want to pay for it. This is not President Obama's debt, not at all. This is what happens when you have almost 8-9 years of uninterrupted borrowing and spending by President Bush and a Republican Congress. Well, this is their debt. And again, I call upon Republicans, reasonable, responsible Republicans, to come forward and give up on this ideological obsession that they have, this new theology that says no tax reform, no raising of revenues from anyone, even those that can afford it the most. Well, Mr. President, I still remain an optimist. It's not too late for reason to prevail. We've heard loudly and clearly from the extremists and the ideologues who would bring down our economic house rather than agree to any compromise. Now it's time for decent, patriotic Americans to speak up and say enough. We can and must come together around a balanced plan to bring our deficits under control, and we must uphold the full faith and credit of the United States of America. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.